Today's lesson is on sound techniques. And when it comes to poetry, remember that there are two main elements of poetry: sound techniques and figurative language. Figurative language is language that is not literal. And after the lessons that we have this week, we will move into figurative language techniques like metaphor, simile, and personification next week. But poetry often will also have sound techniques like rhyme, alliteration, rhythm. Notice, by the way, that both sound techniques and figurative language are things that you would want to avoid when writing a formal paper. In our research papers, for instance, you wouldn't want to have rhyme or alliteration in it. It would sound ridiculous. Nor would you want to include a lot of figurative language like similes and metaphors. But poetry, on the other hand, embraces this. That's another difference between poetry and prose. And so when we're talking about sound techniques, of course, rhyme is a main one. And with the words rat and hat, think about what makes it rhyme. Yes, it is the common vowel sound, the ah sound, but it's also the end sound of each word, the T. And so the two work together to create rhyme. And if both aren't there, it doesn't necessarily rhyme, and sometimes would be called approximate rhyme. But rat and hat certainly rhyme. We've talked a little bit about rhyme scheme, and rhyme scheme is labeling the pattern of end rhyme in a poem. Also, sometimes you have common vowel sounds like this sound, the long A, late, space, raise. But the words don't really rhyme because they don't also have a shared consonant sound in them. And so instead, this one is actually called assonance. You're familiar with this one, I'm sure. Tommy tells time because the initial consonant sound in each word is the same. This is an example of alliteration. But sometimes you have repeated consonant sounds that aren't in the beginnings of words, like hitch and latch. They don't rhyme. And they're also not really alliteration because the beginning sounds are not the same. This is actually called consonance, but we're pretty much going to call it alliteration for our purposes. And so let's first talk about sounds that human beings can create. This is a chart that linguists would use and study to understand how sounds are made. And so let's start with the first one here, M. This one is nasal, meaning that it comes through the nose because the mouth is closed. And so when you say your mouth has to be closed. You can try it, having it open doesn't work so well. It's also bilabial. If you take Spanish, you know labios, that's the word for lips. And so it means that the two lips have to be touching as well. And so if you tried to make the M sound without both of those, you're not going to do very well. Go down to plosive. Think of plosive like explosive. Here you have to push the sound out. And so P and B are very similar. They're bilabial because you have to touch your lips together to do it, but you create a different sound when it's plosive with the P or B sound. That same plosive idea works over here with T and D, but now your lips aren't touching, right? And you can see this even more down here with labiodental fricative. You would imagine that labiodental would mean lips and teeth. And in the case of F, everybody try F, you have to touch your teeth, your top teeth, to your lips. Same with V, you have to touch your top upper teeth to your bottom lip. And so we can go through some of the others over here, velar, K and G, and you see the similarity between those two. And there are sounds that if you speak the English language, you are not really capable of making sounds that might exist in other languages. For instance, we don't roll our R's, and so there's no need for it really in English. But if you learn Spanish, it's a good thing to know how to do. Of course, there are other languages where they wouldn't use, say, L. And then people who end up moving to the United States or other English-speaking countries have a really hard time ever making that sound because in their languages, they don't make it. And so sounds govern a lot of things that we do. It makes things sound good. It makes them sound catchy. And that's what these techniques do in poetry. And so, beginning with rhyme, I mentioned already that we have common vowel and consonant sounds in neighboring words creates rhyme. Cat, hat, crew, stew, may, and ray, and then lime and rhyme. And notice that they don't necessarily have to be spelled the same way. So you don't want to just look at the words visually. For instance, lime and rhyme don't look the same because one uses a Y and one uses an I, but the sound is the same. And that's what creates the rhyme. A rhyme scheme is done by labeling the letters with the end rhyme of each line in a poem. And I showed you that yesterday, and we will practice that a little bit more. And then there's also internal rhyme, which occurs within a line as opposed to being at the end of the line. So some students have difficulty with rhyme. They think that they know what they're doing, and in many cases, it's really approximate rhyme and not actual rhyme. So car and far, they do rhyme because of that commonality in the vowel and the final consonant sounds. But this car rhyme with all, the vowel sound is the same, but the consonant sound is not, as it is the same in all and tall, but not car and all. So some of these you have to think about a little bit. Then we have something like tan and ham. Since N and M are actually similar sounds, these ones do work. They're not the same sound, but they're very similar. And then finally, shoe and rue, they do rhyme, even though the letters are different. And so the next sound technique is the repetition of vowel sounds in neighboring words. It's very similar to approximate rhyme because the words don't completely rhyme because they're only sharing vowel sounds. And so look at this one. Make, raise in space. Doesn't exactly rhyme. So what is it? It's assonance. You may have studied this in middle school, but I found that a lot of middle school teachers say assonance to avoid saying assonance, but you pronounce it assonance. Look at this one. This thin hint, is repeated throughout the version of I. And so that is assonance. Here, you are a huge, rude fool. All of them are the long O sound, okay? Or actually the long U sound. Ooh, huge, you, all of them are the same sound, but it doesn't rhyme. It's really assonance. The next one, I'm sure you're pretty familiar with, and that is alliteration, repetition of consonant sounds at the beginnings of words. And remember that not all consonant sounds are only one letter. Ch, for instance, we do not have a letter for in English. Other languages have a separate letter for that sound. We do not. We combine C and H for it. But Chopper's champion, chatty chimpanzees, is alliteration. In the second one, it's still the first consonant sound, even though we have a vowel before it. Elena elegantly eludes the elevators. And then the final one here, these R's, a lot of them are at the ends of the words and not the beginning, with the exception of rubber and rounded. We're going to call this one alliteration because it's still the repetition of those consonant sounds, although more accurately it would be called consonants when it's not in the beginnings of words, like car, driver, burned. But everybody just calls it alliteration, so we will do the same. The last thing I want to go over briefly is rhythm. And rhythm is difficult to measure without looking at how the poem is composed mathematically, meaning the pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables. And so simply counting the number of syllables per line works really well to ascertain if there is a rhythm. And so once you see that there is some kind of a rhythm, like let's say it goes 10, 10, 10, 10, 10, all the way down, like every line has 10 syllables, that would be a rhythm. If it went 8, 6, 8, 6, that would be a rhythm because there's a pattern there. And there are only certain patterns that work well. And all of these would be considered closed form, even if there's no rhyme in the lines. As long as there's some kind of a pattern that's developed in the number of syllables per line, it is in closed form. So you need to be able to count syllables in order to tell if a poem has a rhythm, if a poem is written in closed form or not. So if you struggle with this, then what you want to do is put your hand underneath your chin when you're talking and going through a particular word. Take the word particular, particular. We see that it is 4 syllables because my chin is hitting my hand 4 times. Another word would be condescending, condescending, 4. And a lot of students have a hard time with it and end up counting more or fewer syllables than there actually are in a word. So that's just a little trick for you to use to tell how many syllables there are in a word. Now you should go to our website and go to the poetry page and look at the tabs underneath it and go to sound techniques. We'll be here for about the next week, and I have the activities all listed here. And today there's no assignment that you need to turn in. Once again, you just need to do the sound techniques matching activity for a few minutes to make sure you know the basics of the sound techniques we'll be studying.